there is a kind of grief that no one prepares you for. Not the grief of losing someone you love, though that is its own particular cruelty, but the grief of a body that hasn't been told yet. The grief of milk that still comes, warm and persistent, for a child who will never drink it. The grief that has no ceremony, no black dress, no neighbours arriving with food and lowered voices. Because the world does not hold funerals for children it never met. It simply moves on and leaves you standing in the middle of the road while everything rushes past. Eliza Fernsby knew that grief intimately. She had carried her son for 9 months. She had felt him turn in the night, those slow, underwater movements that belong to no one else, that exist only between a woman and the life she is making. She had pressed her palm to the rise of her belly and believed, with the foolish, fierce certainty of a woman who has nothing else left to believe in, that he would save her, that he would be the thing that made the abandonment make sense, that he would be the answer to every question she had been too proud to ask out loud. Was I worth staying for? Was any of it real? Does it matter, in the end, that I existed? She had believed he would be hers, entirely, and without condition, in a world that had already taken everything else. He lived for 11 minutes. She counted everyone. Afterward, she lay in the narrow bed of the room she rented above the butcher's shop in the village of Ashwick, and she listened to her own body with a kind of horrified disbelief. Because her body did not know. Her body continued with its ancient, indifferent work, the milk coming in on the second day like a tide that answers to no grief, only to biology and time. She had pressed her hands against herself in the dark and felt the warmth of it, and something inside her had broken in a way she did not have language for. Not her heart, deeper than that. The part of her that had believed, without evidence and against all reason, that the universe was paying attention. 300 miles away, in a manor house that smelled of beeswax and old money and fresh grief, a different kind of loss was settling into the walls. The Duke of Windmir had a son. The Duke of Windmir no longer had a wife. And the child, small, furious, impossibly alive, screamed through the night in a house full of servants who did not know what to do with him, attended by a man who did not know how to hold him without his hands shaking. Dorian Graves, 7th Duke of Windmir, had commanded men in battle. He had negotiated treaties that reshaped borders. He had buried his father at 19 and stepped into a title so heavy it had taken him 2 years to learn to walk normally under the weight of it. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man who was undone by things. And yet, every time he looked at his son, this small, red, catastrophically alive creature who had cost his wife her life and seemed entirely unaware of what he had done, Dorian felt something that was not grief exactly, not love exactly, something far less legible than either, something that lived in his chest like a bird in a chimney, panicked and directionless, and made it very difficult to breathe. 2 people, 2 losses, and between them, a child who was starving. This is the story of what happened when they found each other. If you are new here, welcome. This channel is a place for stories like this one. Stories of people broken in ways the world doesn't see, finding each other in the spaces between what is proper and what is true. If this is the kind of story you've been looking for, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because I promise you will not want to miss what comes next. For those of you who have been here before, thank you. You know what we do here. So settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let me tell you about Eliza Fernsby and the Duke who did not know he needed her. The letter from Mrs. Holt arrived on a Thursday. Eliza almost didn't open it. She had been sitting in the same chair for 6 days, not because she was too weak to move, but because movement felt like a betrayal of something she couldn't name. Every time she stood, the house reminded her that she was alone in it. The rooms were small and stubbornly ordinary, and they had no patience for grief. The kettle still needed to be filled. The fire still needed to be laid. The world was relentlessly, insultingly practical. and Eliza found she had not the energy to meet it. Every time she walked past the cradle she had borrowed from her neighbour, the one she had lined herself with the soft flannel she'd saved for 3 months to buy, she had to look away so quickly that she went dizzy. She had not moved it. She didn't know why. It seemed important not to move it, as though moving it would mean something she wasn't ready to mean. But the letter sat on the table, and Mrs. Holt had been kind to her when no one else had been. The midwife had held her hand through 8 hours of labour, had spoken to her quietly in the dark hours, had been the one to tell her, gently, with a steadiness that Eliza had clung to like a rope, what had happened. And so she opened it. It said, in the midwife's blunt and practical hand, "There is a child at Windmir Manor, a boy, 3 weeks old. His mother died in childbed, and he has refused every wet nurse they have brought him, 4 in total. He is losing weight. The Duke is at his wit's end. I told him I knew someone. I hope you will forgive me for that. Come if you can. Come soon." Eliza read it twice. Then she looked at the cradle. She thought about what it meant, to go, to take this body that had made milk for a child who would never drink it, and offer it to a stranger's child instead. She thought about whether that was a betrayal or a mercy, and she sat with that question for a long time, and in the end she decided that she did not have the luxury of the distinction. She was 24 years old. She had no husband, no money, and no reputation worth speaking of in any county where anyone knew her name. She had a body that was still performing the tasks of motherhood for a child who was gone, and she had, somewhere beneath the grief, a terrible stubbornness, the kind that comes not from strength, but from the refusal to let everything that has happened to you be the final word. She stood up. She began to pack. The journey to Windmir Manor took most of a day, on a mail coach that smelled of wet wool and old leather, and the particular exhaustion of people who are going somewhere they would rather not go. Eliza sat by the window and watched England move past her, the flat fields of Somerset giving way to the rolling greens of the country beyond, and tried not to think about what she was doing. She did not entirely succeed. She thought about the last time she had travelled somewhere with hope. 2 years ago, following a man who had promised her things with the easy confidence of someone who had never been required to keep a promise. She had believed him because she had wanted to believe him, and she had paid for that wanting in the currency that women always pay, quietly, privately, with no one watching and no one to tell. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass of the coach window and told herself that this was different. This was practical. This was survival, not hope. She was very careful about the distinction. The manor was larger than anything Eliza had ever entered through the front door, which she did not, of course. She came through the servants' entrance and was shown to a small but clean room by a housekeeper named Mrs. Garrett, who had the expression of a woman who had weathered many things and expected to weather many more. "The Duke will see you in the morning," Mrs. Garrett told her, already moving down the corridor. "For now, the child is in the East Nursery, 2nd floor, 3rd door. He has been crying for 2 hours." Eliza didn't ask for directions. She followed the sound. The nursery was lit by a single lamp. In the corner, in a chair that looked entirely too rigid for the purpose, sat a man holding a screaming infant with the concentrated desperation of someone disarming an explosive. She took him in quickly, the way she had learned to take in rooms, looking for what mattered, what was wrong, what needed doing first. The man was younger than she expected, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed as though he had started the day with intention and lost it somewhere around noon. His cravat was loosened. His jaw was set in the precise way of someone who is refusing to let a situation be worse than it already is, which she recognized immediately as the expression of a person who has been holding themselves together by force of will for a very long time and is beginning to run out of will. His eyes, when he looked up at her, were the particular shade of grey that only appears in English skies right before a storm. And they were, unmistakably, exhausted. Not merely tired, exhausted in the marrow, in the way that sleep does not fix. This was the Duke of Windmir. He looked like a man who had been holding the world together with both hands for 3 weeks and was beginning to suspect it wasn't working. "You are Mrs. Holt's person," he said. His voice was low, even, careful, the voice of a man who had learned that if he kept his voice level, the rest of him might follow. "Miss Fernsby." "Yes. He won't eat." "I can see that," she said, and held out her arms. He hesitated. She watched the hesitation move across his face, the calculation of what was proper, what was safe, what the protocols were for handing your infant son to a woman you had met approximately 45 seconds ago. She understood the hesitation. She did not have time for it. "Your Grace," she said quietly. "He is hungry. Everything else can wait." Something in him resolved. He stood and crossed the room and placed his son in her arms with a care that was almost painful to watch. The extreme gentleness of a man who was terrified of doing it wrong. Henry Ashford, heir to the Windmir dukedom, was small and red and furious. He weighed almost nothing. He smelled of milk that wasn't quite right, and of clean linen, and of the particular desperation of a small body that had been asking for something and not receiving it for too long. Eliza held him against her chest, and for one terrible moment, she felt it. The specific gravity of holding an infant, the way her body remembered and responded before her mind could intercede, the treacherous warmth of it. She did not think about her own son. She locked that door, and she did not open it. She thought only about this child, this particular child, who was hungry and frightened and had done nothing to deserve either. The crying stopped, not all at once. It faded, like a storm passing, from full fury to hiccups to the small, desperate sounds of a child beginning, tentatively, to trust. His whole body relaxed against her, degree by degree, the way a fist slowly opens. Eliza exhaled. She did not look at the Duke. The Duke did not look away from her. "How did you do that?" he said. It was not quite a question. It had the quality of a man observing something he did not have the framework to explain. "I didn't do anything, Your Grace. He was ready. He just needed someone to be ready too." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things. She was not, by nature, a woman who softened her words to make them easier to receive. Life had not rewarded her for softness, but she watched something move in his face when she said it. A small, involuntary thing, there and gone, and she filed it away without examining it. She sat in the chair by the window. Henry fed. The Duke remained standing in the corner of the room, and Eliza, carefully, precisely, did not look at him. But she was aware of him, in the way you are aware of a candle flame in a dark room, not looking at it directly, but knowing, always, exactly where it is. She was aware of the quality of his stillness, not relaxed, but arrested, as though something had caught him mid-motion and he had not yet decided how to continue. She was aware that he stayed far longer than propriety required. She was aware, when she finally heard him leave, the soft, careful closing of the door, the footsteps retreating down the corridor, that the room felt different without him in it. She told herself it was simply the absence of another adult, the sudden quiet. She was not entirely convinced. A routine established itself, as routines do, not by design, but by the simple tyranny of a child who demanded to be fed at the same hours every day and did not particularly care about social conventions. Eliza rose before dawn. Henry woke at 5, reliable as a church bell and twice as loud. She would hear him from her room down the hall, the first sounds not quite crying yet, more like announcements, as though he were informing the household of his requirements in advance of escalating measures. And she would be halfway to the nursery before she was fully awake, moving on instinct, her body already knowing what was needed before her mind caught up. She did not expect to encounter the Duke in the corridor at 5 in the morning. She encountered the Duke in the corridor at 5 in the morning, Every day for a week, he was always dressed. That was the first thing she noticed, and it unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name, because it meant one of two things, and neither of them was simple. Either he had not slept, or he had risen and dressed himself in the dark hours before dawn, with the same formality he brought to every other hour of the day, as though the grief did not entitle him to so much as a loosened collar. She suspected, watching him in those dim corridor mornings, that it was both. The first morning, they simply looked at each other and said nothing. She went into the nursery. He followed, stood in the corner, watched. She did not explain herself. He did not ask her to. When Henry was settled, Dorian left, quietly, without ceremony, the way a man leaves a room he wasn't sure he was allowed to enter. The second morning, he was already in the nursery when she arrived. Standing over the crib, not touching, just looking at his son with an expression so carefully composed that it told her everything about what was underneath it. She had learned, in her years of watching people be brave in front of each other, that the most controlled faces were always the ones with the most happening behind them. She did not announce herself. She simply went to the chair and sat down, and after a moment he stepped back, and the room held them both without requiring anything of either of them. The third morning, she arrived to find him holding Henry, not with the panicked grip of their first meeting, but tentatively, one hand under the head, one under the back. His enormous frame bent over this tiny creature, with the painful, effortful care of a man learning something he did not know how to ask to be taught. Henry was awake and regarding his father with the profound, unfocused seriousness of a newborn examining the universe. Eliza stood in the doorway. She watched the Duke's face as his son made a small sound, not crying, something else, something exploratory. And she watched the thing that crossed Dorian's expression in that moment. Unguarded and unnameable, and entirely private. She took a quiet step back into the corridor. She waited a full minute before entering again, loudly enough that he would hear her coming. It seemed the decent thing to do. Neither of them said anything about it. But a door had opened, somewhere, in the architecture of those early mornings, and neither of them closed it. It was the library that undid her, the first time. She had asked Mrs. Garrett, in her second week, whether there was somewhere in the house she might find something to read. Her days were long. Henry slept in the afternoons, and she had not thought to bring books. She had left Ashwick in something close to a fugue state, packing only what was practical, leaving behind the small shelf of volumes she had accumulated over years with the careful, deliberate pleasure of someone who cannot afford many things but has decided that books are not negotiable. Mrs. Garrett had looked at her with mild surprise, the particular surprise of a woman recalibrating a category, and told her the library was on the second floor, east wing, and the Duke would not mind. The library was the most beautiful room Eliza had ever been in, floor to ceiling, 4 walls, every inch of them occupied, a ladder on a rail, worn smooth at the grip from decades of hands, light coming through tall windows that faced the garden, falling across the spines in long gold bars. The smell of paper and time and something faintly like cedar, like a room that has been loved for a very long time, by people who knew how to love things quietly. She stood in the doorway for a full minute before she trusted herself to enter. She felt, obscurely, that she might not deserve it, that rooms like this were built for people with histories she didn't have, and that entering without permission of some kind she hadn't been given would reveal her as an imposter. Then she thought, Mrs. Garrett said, and she went in. She was standing on the ladder, her finger trailing along the spines of a row of natural philosophy texts. Buffon, Linnaeus, a battered copy of Gilbert White's Natural History that she had wanted to read for 3 years and never been able to afford, when she heard the door open. Miss Fernsby, said the Duke. She nearly fell off the ladder. She did not fall. She had more dignity than that. But she gripped the rail with both hands and turned to find him standing in the doorway, in his shirt sleeves. looking at her with an expression that contained, she was fairly certain, the faintest possible suggestion of amusement. It was so faint she might have imagined it. She chose to believe she had not. "Your Grace, I was told, Mrs. Garrett said. She was right, too," he said simply, already moving toward the desk at the center of the room. "The library is for use." He sat, opened a ledger, took up a pen, as though she weren't there, as though it were entirely normal for the Duke of Windmir to share his library with the woman who nursed his son, as though the question of what was normal had been quietly retired and replaced with something more pragmatic. Eliza pulled out the Gilbert White, climbed down, sat in the chair by the window. They did not speak for an hour. It was the most comfortable she had felt since she arrived. More than that, it was the most comfortable she had felt in longer than she could precisely identify. There was something in the quality of that shared silence, the particular ease of two people who were not performing anything for each other, that settled into her chest like warmth. She had not realized, until that afternoon, how much of her energy for the past 2 years had gone into performing. Performing fine, performing capable, performing unbothered, performing the exact degree of dignity that a woman in her position needed to perform in order to be treated like a person. She didn't have to perform anything here, in this library, in this chair, with this man who was reading his ledger and asking nothing of her. She could simply be a woman reading a book about birds. It was almost unbearably pleasant. He spoke, eventually, without looking up from the ledger. "Gilbert White," he said. Not a question. He must have noticed when she climbed down. "I've been wanting to read it for years," she said. "I never had a copy." A pause. The scratch of his pen. "You may borrow it," he said. "Any of them. That is what libraries are for." She looked at the shelf, thought about what it would mean. The slow accumulation of afternoons in this room, in this chair, borrowing this man's books. Thought about how much she wanted it and how unwise the wanting was. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, still without looking up. And that was all. But she noticed, when she left that evening, that he had set a bookmark on the corner of his desk. A strip of burgundy ribbon, placed neatly where she would see it. Without comment, without making anything of it, she picked it up. She used it. She did not say anything about it the next morning, in the corridor at 5 o'clock, and neither did he. But she was aware of it, of the small, quiet gesture of it, in the way you are aware of a hand extended in the dark. Later, much later, when she would try to identify the moment things changed, she would come back to those early library afternoons, not because anything happened, because nothing did. Because for an hour at a time, in a room full of books, two people who were both grieving sat near each other and did not perform anything at all, and she would understand, eventually, that this was the thing she had been starving for without knowing it. Not touch, not words, just the permission to exist in a room without apologizing for it. That, she would realize, was rarer than she'd known. It was Lord Percival Ashford who first said it out loud. He arrived in the 4th week, younger than his brother by 6 years, lighter in every possible sense, with the easy confidence of a man who has never been required to be the serious one. He came through the front door as though he owned it, which technically he did not, and immediately began rearranging the atmosphere of the house in the cheerful, oblivious way of someone who has never considered that an atmosphere might prefer to be left alone. Eliza observed him at dinner. She ate with the upper staff, but Percival had discovered this arrangement within approximately 40 minutes of arriving and declared it an abomination. And so she found herself at the family table, while Dorian looked at his brother with the expression of a man who has long ago made peace with losing certain battles. "Miss Fernsby," said Percival, settling into his chair with enormous satisfaction. My brother tells me Henry has taken to you entirely. Henry has taken to being fed, my lord. I happen to be the one providing it." Percival pointed at her. "Modest? Dorian. She's modest. I like her enormously." "Percy," said Dorian, in the tone of a man who has been using that single word as a complete sentence since childhood. "I'm simply making an observation," Percival continued, pouring wine for everyone, including Eliza, without asking. "And the last 4 women ran away. This one is at the dinner table having opinions. Something is different." The Duke looked at his wine glass. Eliza looked at her plate. Lord Percival looked between them with the beatific expression of a man watching something interesting happen in slow motion and having the wisdom not to interfere with it. She was thinking about Percival's words later that night, about what it meant to be different, about the particular danger of being noticed. When she heard it, she was returning from a late feeding, moving slowly through the dark corridor, and a sound stopped her. It came from behind the closed door of Dorian's study, not crying, nothing so legible as that. A sound like something very controlled and very contained straining against its own edges. The sound of a person who has been holding something in for a very long time and has finally, in the small hours when no one is watching, begun to lose the grip. She stood in the hallway. She told herself all the reasonable things. She was the wet nurse. She had no standing here. His grief was not her business, and her compassion was not something he had asked for. The world she lived in had very clear ideas about what women in her position were owed and what they were permitted, and none of those ideas included knocking on the doors of dukes in the middle of the night because she had heard something in the corridor. She stood in the hallway for a long time. Then she knocked. Silence. Then, "I don't require anything." His voice was level, perfect, designed to end the conversation without acknowledging it had begun. "I know," she said through the door. "I wasn't offering anything." A longer silence, the kind of silence that is not empty but occupied, a person on the other side of a door making a decision. The door opened. He had been sitting at the window. She could tell by the chair, angled wrong, drawn too close to the glass. Outside, the grounds were dark. The garden she had begun to love in the daytime was invisible now, just blackness and the occasional shape of a tree against a slightly lighter sky. There was a portrait on the far wall, a woman, fair-haired, painted with the slightly stiff formality of an official portrait. Not cold, exactly, but formal in the way that official portraits always were, as though the painter had been instructed to capture the title rather than the person. Dorian stood in the doorway. He had shed his coat. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and his hair was slightly disordered in a way she had never seen it before. The mark of hands run through it in frustration or distress. The private evidence of feelings he did not allow to be public. He looked, she thought, like a building that had been bearing weight for a very long time and was becoming, slowly, aware of where the cracks were. "You don't have to be all right, you know," Eliza said. Something crossed his face. A rapid succession of things, there and gone, like light changing on water. "I beg your pardon. Everyone in this house keeps treating you as though grief is something to be gotten through quickly and quietly, so we can all return to normal," she said. She was not being unkind. She was simply saying the thing that was true, because she had found, in her experience, that true things often went unsaid for too long, and the silence around them grew teeth. "I just thought someone should say, 'You don't have to be all right. Not tonight. Not in this room.'" He stared at her. She was aware, distantly, that this was possibly the most inappropriate thing she had ever said to anyone, let alone a duke, let alone her employer. She did not take it back. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Still careful, but a different kind of careful. The carefulness of a man choosing precision over protection. "She and I were not..." He paused. "It was not a love match. We were well suited. We respected each other. I believe she was content. But I did not..." He stopped again, looked at the window. "I tried to be a good husband. I am not sure I knew how to be anything more than a correct one. And now I cannot..." He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth briefly. "I cannot understand why I feel like I have lost something I am not sure I ever had." You lost what it could have been, Eliza said. Her voice was very quiet. What you hoped it might become, even if you never said it out loud, even if you barely admitted it to yourself. That's its own kind of grief, Your Grace. It doesn't have a name, so people don't know to take it seriously. But it is real, and it is yours, and you don't have to apologize for it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was open in a way she had not seen before. Not vulnerable exactly. Something more precise than that. Something like the expression of a person who has been speaking a language imperfectly for years and has just, for the first time, heard it spoken correctly. And yours? He asked. She didn't pretend not to understand. Mine has a name. It just doesn't have a solution. I'm sorry, he said, simply, without performance. I know, she said. So am I. She left him there, in the study with the dark window and the formal portrait. But something had shifted, quietly, without announcement, the way the tide turns without anyone marking the exact moment. Neither of them was the same person, walking away from that conversation, as they had been walking toward it. She thought about that, lying in her narrow bed in the small room at the end of the east corridor, listening to the house settle around her. She thought about how strange it was that grief could be a bridge, if you let it. That two people carrying different weights could recognize the shape of each other's burden, across every wall that the world had put between them, and feel, briefly, dangerously, less alone. She told herself to be careful. She fell asleep, already failing at it. Lady Constance Merrow arrived on a Tuesday with 2 trunks of luggage and the particular energy of a woman who has decided that she is the solution to a problem and is merely waiting for everyone else to catch up. She was beautiful, Lady Constance. Eliza was willing to acknowledge this, with the honest detachment she had developed over years of being the woman in the room who was not the most beautiful woman in the room. Fair, composed, impeccably dressed in the restrained way of someone who does not need to try very hard. She had the easy authority of a woman who had never once walked into a room and wondered whether she belonged in it. She had loved the late Duchess like a sister. She wore her grief stylishly and with apparent sincerity, which was a combination that Eliza found herself respecting, even as she recognized the threat of it. Lady Constance was not performing grief. She was genuinely grieving. She simply also believed that grief was not incompatible with pragmatism, and that the pragmatic solution to the Duke's situation was, and had always been, obvious. She noticed Eliza on the 3rd day. The wet nurse, she said, appearing in the corridor with the easy authority of someone who considers every room her natural habitat. Yes, Mrs. Garrett mentioned. How long do you intend to stay, Miss Fernsby, was it? As long as Henry needs me, my lady. Children move on from wet nurses quite quickly, you know. Lady Constance's smile was kind in the way that a closed door is kind. There is no malice in it. It is simply closed. It would be wise not to grow too attached. Eliza smiled, the way women learn to smile when someone has said something that deserves a different response entirely. Wise advice, my lady. Thank you. Lady Constance studied her for a moment with the assessing gaze of a woman who is very good at taking stock of situations. Then she nodded, once, and moved on down the corridor. Eliza stood where she was for a moment afterward. She was not frightened of Lady Constance exactly, but she recognized what she was. A reminder of everything that existed between Eliza Fernsby and the life she was beginning, foolishly and without permission, to imagine. She found Dorian in the library that evening. She had not planned to. She simply went there because it was the one place in the house that felt like breathing, and he was already there, standing at the window with a glass of brandy and the slightly stifled expression of a man who had been gracious for 7 hours straight and was approaching his limit. He turned when she entered. She hesitated, aware, suddenly, of Lady Constance, of what she represented, of the geometry of the situation she was standing inside, without quite having meant to step into it. "I can go," she offered. "Don't." A pause. Quieter. "Please." She sat in her chair. He stayed at the window. Outside, it had begun to rain, the soft, persistent English rain that had no urgency to it, that simply intended to continue indefinitely. "Lady Constance has suggested I should consider remarrying," he said, eventually. "Within the year." "She may be right." "She is almost certainly right." He turned the glass in his hands. "Henry needs, the title requires, there are many reasonable arguments for it that I have been hearing for 3 weeks and cannot find fault with." Pause. "I find I don't particularly care about reasonable at this moment," he said quietly. Eliza looked at her hands. She was very aware of the distance between them, 12 feet, perhaps 15, and equally aware that it was not enough. Not because she wanted it to be less, because she was becoming, despite every effort to the contrary, aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with employment. She noticed when he was tired. She noticed when he was making an effort that cost him something. She noticed the particular quality of his attention when he was in the room. Steady, unhurried. Like a man who has learned to pay close attention to things because he spent too long paying attention to the wrong ones. She was aware of noticing these things. She was aware that the noticing was a problem. She was choosing, with great deliberateness, not to do anything about it. "Your Grace," she said carefully. "Dorian." She looked up. "When we are alone," he said. "Please." Something in his voice. Not a command. Nothing like a command. A request. The kind that knows it is asking for more than it appears to be asking for. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than she should have. "That would be unwise," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He did not take it back. "I am employed in your household. I'm aware. And my situation is not—" She stopped. Started again. "And I am not someone you should be asking things of, even small things." He set down the brandy glass. When he spoke again, his voice was careful in a new way, not protecting himself, trying not to frighten her. "I know what your situation is, Miss Fernsby. I know what was done to you. I know that you came here with nothing, and that you have given my son everything, your time, your care, your body's own sustenance, and that you sit in my library and read natural philosophy and argue with my brother about crop rotation and make me feel, for the first time in months, as though this house contains something other than the echo of what went wrong." The rain hit the windows. "I am asking," he said, "for nothing more than your name. When we are alone. That is all." A long beat. The rain. The lamp. The 12 feet between them that felt like nothing and everything simultaneously. "Dorian," she said. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. The way you close your eyes around something you want to keep. "Thank you," he said. She did not say "you're welcome." She picked up her book. She read 3 pages without taking in a single word. Henry Ashford learned to smile in his 7th week. Not a reflex, those had come earlier. The random muscle movements that parents wishfully interpret as smiles, but which are simply the face learning its own possibilities. This was different. This was a real smile. Full and sudden and directed, aimed at a face he recognized. It arrived like weather, unexpected, transformative, altering everything it touched. He smiled first at Eliza, which she accepted with the specific tenderness of a woman who has learned to receive love carefully in case it is taken back. She held very still when it happened, as though sudden movement might undo it, and she looked at him. This small, serious face suddenly lit from within, and felt something in her chest shift that she had believed was past shifting. She was not his mother. She knew this. She reminded herself of this regularly, with the disciplined frequency of someone managing a chronic condition. She was his wet nurse. She was temporary. She was present because of biology and necessity and the pragmatism of grief. not because she was his or he was hers. She told herself this, and then he smiled at her again, and the telling became slightly harder to hear. He smiled at Mrs. Garrett, who looked briefly and profoundly moved before rearranging her face into its customary practicality. He smiled at Lord Percival, who declared it the greatest achievement in 3 generations of Ashfords and spent 20 minutes trying to get him to do it again. He smiled at the curtains, which was less meaningful but no less enthusiastic. He smiled at his father on a Wednesday morning. Eliza was there. She was always there in the mornings now, not required to be, simply present, the way people become present in places that have started to mean something. She was sitting in the chair by the window, and Henry was awake and kicking his feet with the private satisfaction of someone discovering that their body obeys them, when Dorian came in. Henry heard the footsteps. He turned his head toward the sound, that new, deliberate turning that had replaced the earlier random movements, and found his father's face, and smiled. The Duke of Windmir stopped walking. He stopped as though someone had removed the floor from in front of him. He stood very still, looking at his son, and Eliza watched something happen in his face that she had never seen there before and would never quite find words for afterward. It was not grief, and it was not happiness exactly. It was something that contained both and was larger than either. It was the expression of a man who has been braced for weeks for the worst version of everything and has just been shown, by the most unprepared of messengers, that he was wrong. He crossed the room slowly, bent over the crib. Henry grabbed his finger with both hands, with the absolute conviction of someone who has decided this particular thing belongs to them and has no intention of returning it. Dorian laughed, softly, under his breath, surprised entirely out of himself, but a laugh, a real one, unguarded and uncontrolled, the kind that is not performed but simply escapes. Eliza pressed her hand over her mouth. She looked out the window. Outside, the garden was beginning, cautiously, to turn towards spring. She did not cry. She had made herself a rule about crying in the nursery, and she kept it. And it cost her considerably. The word came at 4 months. Henry had been making sounds for weeks, the experimental syllables of a child testing the machinery of language, learning that his mouth could produce effects in the world, ba and da and long vowel sounds aimed at the ceiling with great seriousness, as though making an announcement to the plasterwork. Eliza talked to him constantly, because she had read somewhere that language came from hearing it, and because the truth was that talking to Henry was the only talking she did all day that required nothing of her in return. She told him about the plants in the garden, which she had been learning from the head gardener on her afternoon walks. She told him about the books she was reading. She told him, carefully, in a voice that would not carry beyond the 2 of them, about the village she had grown up in, and the smell of the bakery on the high street in winter, and the particular way her father's hands had looked when he was reading, large and quiet in his lap. She told him about a man she had loved and the specific way he had said her name the first time, which had made her believe, foolishly, that something about it meant something. She told Henry things she had never told anyone, because he could not tell them back, and because the telling felt necessary in ways she didn't fully examine. She was telling him about sparrows, about the way they flocked in the hedgerows outside her window and moved as a single entity, one rippling shape made of hundreds of small ones, when it happened. She stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Henry looked at her. His face, for a 4-month-old, had become remarkably legible. She had learned to read its moods the way you learn to read weather. This expression was concentrated, effortful, the expression of a person trying very hard to do something precisely right. He said it again. Not mama, not dada, Liza, imperfect, approximate, 4 months old, and the consonants were still learning their manners, but unmistakable, and aimed directly at her, and said with the triumphant certainty of someone who has been working toward this for a long time, and is very pleased to have arrived. She did not cry. She held Henry against her chest, her chin on top of his head, and she breathed very carefully and methodically, and she kept the rule she had made, and it was the hardest she had ever kept it. Because she understood what this was. She understood what she had become to this child, and what that meant about what she would have to leave behind when she left. She had known, in the abstract, since the beginning. Now she knew it in the specific. Now it had a name, and the name was the shape of her own name, in a 4-month-old's mouth. And it was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing she could imagine. Dorian had been in the doorway. She didn't know for how long. She had not heard him come in, and she would wonder, later, how long he had been standing there. When she finally looked up, he was watching her with an expression she had no name for, something that lived between reverence and grief, and the particular terror of a man who has just understood something that will make the next decision considerably harder. "He chose you," Dorian said, very quietly. Her voice was not entirely steady. "He doesn't understand what he's saying." "He understands exactly what he's saying." Dorian's eyes moved to his son, then back to her. "So do I." The silence that followed was very full. Eliza stood up. She needed, suddenly, to be somewhere that was not this room. "I'll bring him to you after his next feeding," she said, in the voice she used when she needed everything to be practical. "He's been sleeping well in the afternoons. You might try reading to him. I've found he responds to a low voice." She walked out of the nursery. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. And she allowed herself, very briefly, in the privacy of that small room with the door closed, to feel the full weight of what was happening to her. The thing she had been refusing to name. The thing that had been growing in the spaces between library afternoons and corridor mornings and one conversation through a door at midnight. She felt it, all of it, for exactly 3 minutes. Then she stood up, washed her face, and went back to work. Lady Constance found her in the garden the following afternoon. Eliza had gone out because the house felt too full of things she couldn't look at directly. The nursery had Henry and the echo of that word. The library had the chair by the window and the bookmark she had been given without ceremony. The corridor had the mornings. Every room in Windmir Manor had become, without her consent, freighted with something she could not carry and could not put down. She had walked to the far end of the garden where the formal hedges gave way to something wilder, a section that the head gardener referred to, with gentle disapproval, as the old part, where the planting was older than the current house and had largely made up its own mind about what it wanted to do. She liked it there. It felt honest. Lady Constance appeared at the edge of the formal hedges as though she had been waiting for the right moment, which Eliza suspected she had. "I'll be direct, Miss Fernsby," she said, coming to stand beside her. "I don't think you're a bad person. That's generous, my lady. I think you're a kind person in an impossible situation, and I think you are quite intelligent enough to know exactly what I'm about to say." Eliza said nothing. She kept her eyes on the old part of the garden, on a climbing rose that had made its way up an ancient stone wall and was beginning, tentatively, to bud. He needs a wife of his standing," Lady Constance said. Her voice was careful and not unkind. "Henry needs a mother who can move through the world he will inhabit, who can go where he will go, know the people he will know, open the doors that will need to be opened. You have given that child something remarkable. I mean that sincerely. What you have given him in these months, the stability, the care, I won't pretend it isn't extraordinary." She paused. "But what you can give him now, in this house, at this stage, it will begin to harm him. Not because of who you are, because of what the world is. The servants talk already. The neighbourhood will begin to talk. And when Henry is old enough to understand what is being said about his father and the wet nurse—" "You don't need to continue," Eliza said. "I know," said Lady Constance, quietly. A long silence between them, the honest silence of two women who both understand, with complete clarity, the rules of the world they live in, and how little those rules care about what is real, or true, or deserved. Eliza thought about the 3 minutes in her room, about how precisely she had measured them, and how completely she had failed to feel nothing. "I'll speak to Mrs. Garrett," she said. "I'll make arrangements to leave by the end of the week." Lady Constance nodded once, and did, Eliza thought, have the grace to look as though it cost her something. There was no triumph in her face, only the expression of a woman who has done what she believed necessary and does not particularly enjoy believing it. "I am sorry," Lady Constance said, "for what it is worth." "It's worth something," Eliza said, and meant it. She had not planned to say goodbye. A letter had seemed cleaner for him and cleaner for her, because she was honest enough with herself to know that if she said it to his face, she would not say it well, and saying it poorly would be worse than not saying it. But she went to the library. She told herself she was retrieving the Gilbert White, which she had left on the table. She told herself it would take 3 minutes. She told herself many things, standing in that corridor, and none of them were entirely true. She had been in the library for 20 minutes, holding the book and a piece of paper and a pen and not writing anything, when she heard him. "Mrs. Garrett tells me you've asked for a reference letter," Dorian said from the doorway. She set the pen down. "Henry is nearly weaned. It was always going to be time. Eventually. Eventually is not this week. It needs to be this week." He stepped into the room. She made herself stay where she was, made herself not step back, which was what her body wanted to do, and also not step forward, which was what some other, less sensible part of her wanted. Is this Constance? Not a question, just a thing he knew. "It's sense," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Whatever you may prefer to think, it is only sense, and you know it. I cannot be here and be. I cannot stay and be what I am to Henry when the world will make that into something that hurts him, either by making it into something it isn't, or by making it into something it is. Either way he suffers for it. Either way you suffer for it." She stopped, started again, quieter. "And I am not. I cannot." She looked at the window, the lamp, anywhere but his face. "I am not someone who can afford to make the mistake of staying somewhere I am not meant to be. I have already done that once. I know how that ends. And if I asked you to stay..." She made herself look at him, made herself hold the gaze. "As what, Dorian? As what would you ask me to stay?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that the quality of the silence changed, became not hesitation, but the specific sound of a man confronting the honest answer to an honest question and finding it inadequate. She watched him. She watched him try to find something that was true and good and sufficient. And she watched him fail. And she loved him for the trying, and it did not make anything easier. "I thought so," she said softly. She picked up the pen. She wrote the letter, brief, professional. The letter of a woman who is certain of what she is doing. She set it on his desk, and she picked up the Gilbert White, and she walked out of the library, and she did not look back. If she had looked back, she would have seen him standing very still in the centre of the room, holding the letter she had written him and looking at it with the expression of a man who has just been shown exactly what his silence cost. She did not look back. Some mercies you have to give yourself. She was gone for 11 days. He counted every one. The house was the same. That was the confounding thing. The house was entirely, stubbornly, insultingly the same. The same corridors, the same rooms, the same library with the same chair by the window, which he could not look at without feeling something he did not have a name for. The same east corridor at 5 in the morning, which was just a corridor now. Empty in a way that corridors are not supposed to be empty, because corridors don't usually have presences, not ones you notice, not ones you miss. He noticed. He missed. He said neither thing out loud, because he was the Duke of Windmir, and there was no protocol for what he was feeling, and he had spent his entire adult life making his interior landscape conform to the requirements of his exterior one. It was not working very well. Henry did not understand where she had gone. He was too young to understand, but old enough to feel the absence as a wrongness. A missing note in a piece of music he had been hearing his whole short life. He was fretful, and then quiet, and then fretful again, in the unspecific way of a person who knows something is wrong but cannot identify what. He said her name once, on the third day, just once, into the quiet nursery at the hour when she used to come, the 5 o'clock hour, the dark corridor hour, as though announcing himself to someone who should have been there. No one answered. Dorian stood in the doorway and listened to his son call for a woman who was not there, and felt something move through him that had no English word for it. Only the dull, precise knowledge that he had been the reason she was not there, that his silence, when she had asked him the only question that mattered, had been its own answer. On the 5th day, Lord Percival looked at him over breakfast and said, without preamble, "You're an idiot. Percy, I mean that with great affection. You are a genuinely, profoundly remarkable idiot. She stood in that room and told you she was leaving and you let her go. She told me she needed to. There's a difference." "There is no difference." Percival set down his fork. "She needed you to give her a reason to stay. She stood there and asked you what you wanted, and you stood there, like a very tall, very handsome piece of furniture, and you said nothing. Nothing, Dorian. Not one word." "I didn't know what to offer her," Dorian said. His voice was level, and he was deeply tired of it being level. A position that cannot be named in public, a life that would require her to be invisible in every room she deserved to occupy. I did not want to offer her something that was less than she deserved, and dress it up as love. Percival was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its lightness. "And if you offered her everything," he said, "your name, your house, the full thing, all of it, not hidden, not managed, what then?" Dorian looked at his brother. "The world will not accept it," he said. "The world will manage. It has managed worse." Percival leaned forward. "The question is not whether the world accepts it. The question is whether you can live with the alternative, whether you can watch Henry grow up asking where she went, whether you can sit in that library for the next 40 years and feel that chair." A long silence. "She was abandoned once," Dorian said quietly. "She will not believe me. She has very good reasons not to believe me." "Then you'll have to be better than her reasons," said Percival simply. "You'll have to say it in a way that cannot be mistaken for the last man who said it. And then you'll have to mean it, and show the meaning, and keep showing it, which I observe will not require any great effort on your part, because you have been obvious about how you feel since approximately the 3rd morning. She walked down that corridor, and you started coincidentally being awake at 5 o'clock. Dorian looked at his brother for a long time. He thought about the letter she had left on his desk. Brief, professional. The handwriting of a woman who had decided. He had read it 6 times and felt, each time, the precision of what he had failed to say and what that failure had cost her. A woman who had already been failed by someone's silence, someone's absence, someone's careful non-commitment, and had been failed again by his. He thought about Henry saying her name into the empty nursery. He thought about the bookmark, the ribbon on the desk, the quiet, complete way she had sat in a chair and read for an hour and asked nothing of him. The way she had said his name, Dorian, for the first time, in the lamplight, with the rain against the windows. He stood up. He called for his horse. She was in her father's garden when he came. It was a small garden, nothing like Windmir, nothing like the old part with the climbing roses and the wall that knew its own mind, but it was her father's, and it was familiar, and it smelled of the particular green smell of Somerset in spring. And she had been standing in it for 20 minutes, accomplishing nothing except the conscious work of not thinking about anything. She had been in her father's house for 11 days. She had been helping with the house. She had been sleeping long hours. She had been, slowly and with great effort, doing the work of convincing herself that she had made the right choice, the sensible choice, the choice that protected Henry and Dorian and the small, fragile life she would have to build for herself, somewhere, from whatever remained. She had not finished convincing herself. She was still working on it. She thought, with more time, it might take. She was in the garden when she heard the horse. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. That was the first thing she noticed, before she had entirely registered that it was him. The road dust, the disordered hair, the particular exhaustion of a man who has been arguing with himself for 11 days and has finally, at considerable cost, lost. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. He walked toward her with the stride of a man who has made a decision and is not going to allow himself the time to unmake it. "Your Grace," she began. "Don't," he said. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up. She had a brief, absurd thought about how tall he was, how she had never quite gotten used to it, the way the scale of him reorganized every room he stood in. "I let you walk out of that library because I was afraid," he said. His voice was even. It had cost him to make it even, she could tell. Not of what the world would say. "I have managed the world's opinions before, and I will manage them again. I was afraid of what I was asking you to accept." He paused, not losing his nerve, gathering it. "A child who isn't yours, though he has chosen you as completely as it is possible for any person to choose another. A household full of someone else's history. A man who is still," his jaw tightened briefly, "who is not entirely put back together, who does not know, yet, all the ways he might fail, and is terrified of failing you specifically." Something in her chest had gone very still and very warm. "And then I was afraid you'd say no," he continued. "And then you were gone, and Henry called your name into the dark at 5 o'clock, and I understood that there are some fears that simply do not matter, that there is only one fear that matters, and it is this, a life in which I chose my own cowardice over you." "You're a duke," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she was no longer trying to make it so. "Yes. I have no name to speak of, no family with standing. I am the woman who... I know what you are," he said quietly. "I know what was done to you. I know that someone stood in front of you once and made promises and left. And I know that the last thing you need from me is promises that sound like his did. So I am not going to promise you things that exist only in the future." He reached out and took her hands, both of them, with the same careful, deliberate grip she had seen him use the first time he held his son. As though he understood, precisely, what he was holding. I am going to tell you what is true right now, today, in this garden," he said. "That I have been awake at 5 o'clock every morning for 11 days, walking a corridor that is only a corridor. That I sat in the library last night and felt your absence in that chair more completely than I have felt most presences. That my son says your name, and when he says it, I understand that he is not confused. He knows exactly who you are to him." He paused. "Bump, and so do I." She looked at him for a long time. She had promised herself, after the last time, that she would not be moved by words, that she would require evidence, that she would not let the shape of a sentence, however well constructed, convince her of something that only time and action could prove. She had made that promise, and she had intended to keep it, and she still intended to keep it. But he had ridden through the night. That was not a sentence. That was not a promise. That was a man who had weighed the distance against the alternative and chosen the distance. "You understand that this will be difficult," she said. Her voice was very careful, very precise. The voice of a woman who loves someone and is still trying to protect herself from it. "That there will be people who will not, that Henry will have to." "I know," he said. "I have thought about all of it, every version, And the version where I do not go after you is the only one I cannot live with. Henry will need an enormous amount of explaining to do, she said at last, when he's old enough to understand any of this. Dorian's mouth curved. I suspect he'll find it very funny. He has your sense of humour. So, none. He laughed. That unguarded, uncontrolled laugh she had kept in her chest like a warm stone for 11 days. She had taken it out and looked at it every evening and put it carefully back. She stepped forward. He met her halfway. She would say, later, that the kiss was nothing like what she expected. Not the dramatic, consuming thing that she had read about in novels and had never quite believed in. Not a declaration, simply honest. Two people who had been through the worst of each other, the grief and the silence and the carefully performed adequacy, choosing yes, choosing it plainly, without performance, without conditions. Her hands found the front of his coat. His arms came around her, careful and then certain, the way he did most things, slowly, deliberately, and then completely, simple and absolute, and entirely, completely hers. Henry Ashford took his first steps on a Tuesday morning in the nursery at Windmir Manor, between his father's outstretched hands and his mother's voice. He had been threatening to walk for 2 weeks, pulling himself upright on every available surface, standing with the intense, furrowed concentration of someone solving a very difficult problem, then sitting back down with an expression suggesting the problem required more thought. The household had been in a state of suspended anticipation. Even Mrs. Garrett had been observed lingering near the nursery door at intervals. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with no ceremony. Dorian was on his knees at one end of the nursery with his hands out, and Eliza was at the other end with Henry standing against her leg, and she said his name the way she always said it, warm and certain and without condition. And Henry looked at her, and looked at his father, and made the calculation. 4 steps. Unsteady. Gloriously effortful. Each one an act of faith. Then he sat down with great deliberateness, looked at both of them, and said what sounded very much like well. Dorian laughed until his eyes were bright. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and his shoulders shook, and his son looked at him with profound satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who has caused the desired effect. Eliza, the Duchess of Windmir, in a marriage that had scandalized exactly the number of people her husband had predicted and delighted exactly the number that Lord Percival had predicted, which was most of them, sat on the nursery floor in a morning gown that cost more than she used to earn in a year and held out her arms. Henry crawled back to her, used her sleeve to stand, regarded the distance to his father with the air of a person reassessing a challenge, and tried again. There is a kind of grief that no one prepares you for, but there is also a kind of love like that, the kind that does not announce itself, that does not arrive in a grand gesture or a turning point you can mark on a calendar. That comes in instead through small doors, a corridor at 5 in the morning, a bookmark left without comment on a desk, a child who learns your name before he learns any other. The kind that is built, over weeks and months, out of shared silences and honest conversations and the radical, quietly revolutionary act of being known. The kind that chooses you before you have chosen it, before you are ready, before you have talked yourself back into the belief that you deserve it. And when it finds you, even in the ruins, even in the grief, even in the body that has been broken, and the heart that has been left, and the life that was taken from you before it could begin, you will know it by this. It will not ask you to be all right. It will not require you to perform anything, or explain yourself, or be smaller so that it can be more comfortable. It will simply stay. And that, in the end, is everything. If this story stayed with you, if Eliza's grief sat in your chest, or the moment Henry said her name made you hold your breath, or Dorian's ride through the night made you finally exhale, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Tell me which moment got you. I read every single one. And I mean that. If you're new here and you made it all the way to the end, welcome. This is what we do. Stories about people who are broken in the ways the world doesn't hold funerals for. Finding each other anyway. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you know someone who needs a love story right now, please send this to them. Sometimes that's all it takes. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other. I'll see you in the next one.